All right, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for being here. We've been prepping for this for some time, so it's just really, really exciting to see so many of you here this morning who are interested in this kind of work. So I'm Jennifer Vey. I'm a senior fellow here at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, and I'm the director of the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking, which we launched back in November of 2018, so we're relatively new here at Brookings. So the mission of the center is to inspire public and private and civic sector leaders to make transformative place investments that help generate widespread social and economic benefits. And so I think you can already see from the conversation we've had so far how this really aligns with this work around playful learning landscapes. And so actually this is pretty unique. It's a really unique partnership that brings this, the Bass Center's expertise on placemaking and inclusive economic development together with the expertise of the Center for Universal Education on the learning sciences, with the goal really, as you've heard, of transforming our everyday places into learning opportunities for families and for children. So the last panel focused a fair bit on those early learning aspects of play. And playful learning. And what we're going to do here is kind of shift gears just a little bit to really start to dig into how these efforts and interventions with playful learning landscapes can help revitalize public spaces, can help generate community ownership that Kathy mentioned, and pride, can spur social interaction, both among kids and their caregivers, but also among adults by bringing them together in these spaces, and ultimately really just create more vibrant and family-friendly communities. So first I'm going to introduce our panels, and then we're going to get going into what I think is going to be a pretty robust discussion. So I have here on my left Nidhi Gulati, who's a Senior Director for Programs and Projects at Project for Public Spaces in New York City. She is a trained architect and an urban researcher who has been with PPS since about 2013. And in that capacity, and you'll get to hear a little bit more about this today, she's worked on more than 20 projects across the U.S. and abroad. We have Elliot Weinbaum, who's a program director at the William Penn Foundation, where he works with a team that supports efforts to improve teaching and learning from early childhood through high school. And William Penn, again, is a supporter of CUE and this event, so thank you, Elliot. And Sarah Siplak is the director of the Playful Pittsburgh Collaborative, which is a group of organizations that are dedicated to advancing the importance of play in the lives of children, families, and communities in the Pittsburgh region. And she and her husband are also in a band called Rec Kids, which I wish that I could somehow weave that into this conversation here. So if you can find a way to work it in, please do so, because I'm dying to know, and we might have to talk later. All right. So at the end of the presentation, of Helen's presentation, she quoted the Mayor Enrique Peñalosa of Bogota, who said, "Children are a kind of indicator species. If we build a successful city for children, we will have a successful city for all people." So I'm going to start with Sarah. Can you give us some examples of how the Playful Pittsburgh Collaborative is working to make Pittsburgh a successful city for children? And how might the ambitions of Playful Learning Landscapes really fit into that work that you're doing?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you for having us here from Pittsburgh. Well, I specifically am very excited to be learning about everything that's going on. And it's really going to help us moving forward, thinking about how we do the work that we do. So the Playful Pittsburgh Collaborative has been around for around 8 years. And it started really as kind of a brainchild between 3 entities, which I think speaks so much to this idea of placemaking and collaboration, hence the name, the collaborative. So Trying Together, which is actually where my work is housed, the work of the Playful Pittsburgh Collaborative is housed, is an early childhood advocacy organization. So Cara Simonillo, who's our executive director, it was her conversation with the director of education at the Carnegie Museum of Art, and then the director of education at the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy. So really these 3 entities who had their own buckets of work that they were doing, who came together, had this conversation around play through the work that they were doing, and this idea was born to kind of foster this idea of play within a community and how there are so many different organizations that have different work that they are doing and how they all really relate to play and community building. And so the organization has grown significantly over the years. We're up to about 20 organizations that all do very varying degrees of work within their communities. And so we come together to advocate for play, our mission is really to raise awareness, to educate decision makers, and to model and inspire. So we really have done a lot of work in bringing communities together through an annual Ultimate Play Day, which really came out of this idea of the Ultimate Block Party. How can we bring communities together and organizations that are already working within those communities on behalf of families and children, and have a day of play that focuses on why play is important and why caregiver-child interaction is so important in the world of play. And then the big project that I think ties so nicely into what we're talking about today is the concept of the Hazelwood Play Trail. Hazelwood is a community in Pittsburgh that was identified as one neighborhood that was a play desert. And so when Kaboom came in many years ago to talk about this idea, or to actually implement putting playgrounds into, I think it was 10 communities originally, but really the Play Collaborative came together, and there was this mindset of how can we think about building community and play so that it doesn't have to be based so specifically on building playgrounds. How can we build a community that is playful and that thinks about play along the way and how our lives are shaped by play? And so this concept is a work in progress, and it's something that we are hoping to learn more about as we move forward on how we can replicate this in other communities and help communities think about why play is important and how it can change how they view their own community and their own neighborhoods. And so much of what was discussed on this first panel really brought to mind the work that we've been doing in Hazelwood, including bringing in, I think he left, but the gentleman who asked about police officers, they have a chess program that they do, the Pittsburgh Police. And so we've partnered with them to do different work in the community. And so really this idea of how can we bring all these different entities together. The member organizations range from Age Friendly Greater Pittsburgh, which works with the aging population, All for All, which is an immigrant and refugee advocacy organization. They all are at the table at the Play Collaborative because they inherently understand why play is important, how play is a connector, and how it can help to build community. So we are really looking at how can we build play through the existing organizations that are in our city, in Pittsburgh. And really Playful Learning Landscapes opens up the door for us to think a little bit more about how we can learn from what is happening. What are the outcomes that are happening through the work that we're doing? It's not something that we have had the resources to really do up to this point. And now we're starting to think about, well, if we want to grow this, if we want this to grow and change, we need to find partners out there who are already doing this work and who can help us define this a little bit more.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. That was really, really helpful. Elliot, we're going to move across the state. Can you talk about Philadelphia's efforts to create a more playful city and give some specific examples of some of the projects that the William Penn Foundation has funded? And as you're thinking about this and understanding that both are important, to what extent are the projects that you've been involved in about play versus playful learning? And what does that kind of spectrum look like?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Jen. So for us, this playful learning initiative fits within a broader set of strategies, right? We are looking at supporting teachers, we are looking at supporting parents and other adult family members in a variety, to Joan's point, ensuring that the resources are there to make the kinds of public investments that are needed in all of these spaces to support two goals in particular that the foundation has. One is kindergarten readiness and the other is third grade reading. So for us, the learning, defined broadly, to Kathy's point, the kindergarten readiness, it includes vocabulary, it includes letter recognition, but it also includes what you want to call social emotional skills, 21st century skills, the 6 C's, et cetera. And so we're constantly thinking about the role of playful learning in building those skills. And I would say the investments that the city, we and others in the city have been making fall into maybe 3 categories. There are the big infrastructure investments, and you saw Urban Thinkscape being a key example of that. Some of the infrastructure that the library has been creating within branches. Those are large structural investments that really do stimulate and encourage the kinds of interaction that we know build the brain, build vocabulary, build a whole range of skills. So that's one big category. Another is a lighter touch. Some of the signage that you saw in supermarket speak or talk it up, that exists in supermarkets, it exists in laundromats, it exists in public spaces. That's a lighter touch, but also demonstrates or has encouraged the kinds of interaction that we know is necessary. And the third, I would say, is programming, animating public spaces with activities that are accessible to all and engage young children and often their families in learning opportunities that are fun. Something that the city has called play streets, for example. Kathy referenced earlier, hiring teenagers during the summer, closing streets and creating activities that have a basis in science and early learning is one example. Also involved the Police Athletic League in that, to the earlier question, along with free library branches, Boys and Girls Clubs, and others to build the community around that playful work. Recently, I learned from Junlei Lee, who's at Harvard and at Simple Interactions Institute, this essential question, right? How does this fill in the blank policy, installation, program, practice help to encourage, enrich, and empower human interaction around and with children, right? And so that's sort of the guiding question for us in many of our investments. How do we encourage, enrich, and empower that interaction that we know is so important for learning?
Great. So you talked about activating public spaces, and certainly Project for Public Spaces has done a lot of that over the years, working in and importantly with communities and with neighborhoods across the globe on projects to reimagine and reinvent public spaces with really a focus on improving physical and social and emotional and ecological health and well-being of communities. So, Nidhi, can you talk about how the community engagement piece is really central to your work and how that approach aligns with the mission and the values of Playful Learning Landscapes?
Right. Absolutely. First of all, thank you, everyone. Talk about imposter syndrome. I'm going to take a second. For those of you who don't know Project for Public Spaces, we're a planning and design nonprofit. We're based in New York City. We've been in existence for 43 years. And as a nonprofit, our mission is to create a world where every person has a say in how their public spaces are designed, with a direct through line to how their community gets strengthened. So with that in mind, we believe very strongly that public spaces that are created with and for the community's unique needs are in fact then unique, and then they lend themselves to like tremendous benefits to the social, physical, and economic sort of capital of the community. So with that in mind, every project that we work on has a very strong community engagement component to it, because what better way to understand what is it that makes that community unique and what are their unique opportunities and challenges than to go and ask that community and try to understand with them what it is that makes them unique. So we try to do that through all the projects that we work on. We always modify our approach for community engagement, understanding the level of access that that community has and the unique ways in which the community wants to be engaged, because not everybody likes that sit-down meeting. Not everybody likes to have a focus group or an interview and things like that. So understanding the unique needs and access that people have to information, to community engagement, and responding with a community engagement strategy that reflects those needs. The benefit of that, there are many, as you pointed out. You know, we get public spaces that are unique, we get communities that are engaged, we get the opportunity to build stewardship and ownership from the very beginning. So in alignment with Playful Learning Landscapes, that is the opportunity to kind of get the new young people and citizens of the world involved and get them really to be attached to that space, become stewards of the space and things like that. But also, at least from my personal point of view, I think we have a tremendous return in tolerance in the future. Where in 2020 we have incredible inequities in the world, we have incredible divides. So how do we create those bridges between people from different walks of life? Public spaces give us that common ground where those bridges can be built, where tolerance can be built. The flip side of that is we could create a space that doesn't account for the community's unique needs. It can be as pretty as possible, as dynamic as possible, but it risks creating that othering. Who is it for? It risks creating distrust in our public processes associated with planning, and it risks basically creating an atmosphere that is not for the community that's there. So community engagement is very important to our work. We try to customize the approach as possible to get customized results. And I see that very prominently aligned with Playful Learning Landscapes because our world is getting more urban. The number of kids growing up in cities is going to be more and more. So that just basically means in percentages, the percentage of the community that's going to be children and their caregivers is going to be larger. And we will not be able to design public spaces with the community by kind of leaving out a third or more of that community. So I'm very excited.
Great, thanks. So, Sarah, at the end of your comments, you started to raise a little bit the issue around measurement and outcomes, and I want to pivot to really delve into that a little bit. It certainly came up in some of the questions at the end too. That if we want to be able to scale some of this work, we need to be able to prove that it works, and I think works in many different ways. So, as you heard from Helen and you heard on the last panel, we know something about the evidence from the installations and the efforts to date around caregiver interaction, around words spoken, in terms of STEM and literacy and vocabulary. But we probably know a little bit less around those neighborhood level impacts, those community level impacts. So maybe start with Elliot and then pass it on to Nadine and Sarah. How can we really go about measuring those neighborhood level impacts? What should we be measuring? What's most important? Issues around crime came up or stress came up, valuation in spaces, all sorts of things that we can be measuring, but what's most appropriate to be measuring, and how do we do so in a way that really shows that beyond just the learning aspects, there's a whole other range of important outcomes that can come out of this work?
Yeah, I would say that we have been mostly focused on the change in that adult-child interaction. That has been the outcome goal, if you will, of much of this work. And the evaluation that's happened at the site level has been very compelling. The increases in both quantity and quality of interaction, variation of broader vocabulary, the kinds of collaboration and critical thinking that you want to see in interaction has been evidenced and documented at the sites. I think there's a question about the, if you could call it durability or transferability of those behaviors into other settings, right? That's also part of our goal. Not that it only happens at Urban Thinkscape or in the supermarket when prompted by the sign, but that it happens also when children and their caretakers go home, or they're in other places in their communities where these bits of infrastructure or programming don't exist. And so I think we need to know a bit more about that first. Mm-hmm. So that's another frontier in research that is worthy of investigation, this question of transferability. The question of the neighborhood effects is another sort of frontier that we're trying to advance. Challenging for two reasons. I think one is we don't yet have neighborhoods that have sufficient density, as Kathy mentioned, of opportunities so that families are meeting these things in lots of places and in sufficient number that you would expect to see big change at the neighborhood level. So that's one challenge. The other is it's difficult to measure behavior change anyway on a broad level, and particular behaviors you're looking for to happen in the home, for example, right, to that question of transfer, the degree to which this transfers into the home. So those are some challenges in doing this, but I think there are also some emerging opportunities. We're in conversation currently, for example, with a number of community groups who are really interested in creating multiple opportunities within their small neighborhoods to create that kind of density of experience. And so evaluating that is one. Kaboom is in the process of doing a Playful Learning Challenge in Philadelphia, and we'll create somewhere between 15 and 20 installations in neighborhoods around the city. There is the possibility that those exist in sufficient density as well to begin to measure neighborhood effects. And finally, we're looking at creating a citywide survey of adult-child interactions with the hopes that we'll be able to drill down deeply enough at the neighborhood level to understand or examine relationships between the patterns in adult-child interactions and the other investments that have been made in infrastructure, other playful learning opportunities by neighborhood or community. So I think some work to come on all of that, but it hasn't happened yet, really.
Yep. Nidhi, so of course, Project for Public Spaces does a lot of work in those spaces, and presumably tries to focus on, well, how do we know what all these varying efforts, knowing that they vary significantly across place, how do we know that they're working? What works best? How can you take some of those learnings and kind of transfer that into the Playful Learning Landscapes kind of efforts to understand the extent to which they're having these neighborhood level impacts?
Right, so I will go to our kind of typical Project for Public Spaces approach to that, is that we look to combine the qualitative data with the quantitative data. So like really thinking about, in a narrative way, in a storytelling manner, what are some of the qualitative benefits that people may be having that we may still be struggling to measure and quantify, because matrices are being developed, but as we do, let's look to some of the more sort of qualitative benefits. And then thinking about learning beyond the typical learning outcomes that people anticipate. So like thinking about community benefits, social cognition, cultural cognition, just being, how do you measure that kids who are growing up around these environments are not othering other people based on differences, and like seeing the world more as a cohesive, diverse landscape. So really tuning into those social indicators, really tuning into those community indicators is where I would hope to go. And again, we're in a room full of people who understand matrices and are looking for evidence for this stuff. I'm sure we'll be able to get to some of those matrices as well. But I would, like I said, go beyond learning and go beyond kids, especially focusing on caregivers. How are their social indicators and their community life and their kind of achievements as they continue to grow as parents themselves, looking into those matrices as well.
Great, great. Is there anything to add on this issue of measurement and outcomes?
As you both were thinking, it just made me think of how, I mentioned that we haven't really done the research or analysis behind measuring the outcomes. However, in doing this work on the ground, there is a very noticeable outcome, which is pride of ownership, joy in playing. And this is something that we have 100% noticed through the work that we've done without doing any research behind it or having anyone sit there to measure what's happening in interacting with the community members in Hazelwood where we're doing this work. There has been a significant shift. One of the play stops that we helped to create was Dillamato's Market, is this small local grocery store. There's another term in communities called a food desert also. So Hazelwood did not have a grocery store. So anyway, there's a small grocery store. We did a play installation. I didn't personally, but we helped to put up a play installation on the front of the building. And in speaking with Diane, the business owner, she said, it has just brought so much joy to me and to our community members. They're playing with these, I'm happy to tell you more about it, magnetic fruit that goes on a design on the front of the building. It's encouraging interaction between the caregivers and people who are coming to shop in the grocery store. They're playing as they come in. And then even in one of the green spaces that we helped to convert from a vacant lot to a play space for teens, it was vandalized very early on, right after we had a bunch of plantings put in. Within a week, a bunch of kids came in, ripped all the plants out, and were playing football with it. It broke my heart. However, the community really stepped up, and it brought me to tears to think about how they took ownership of this space because it was in their community, and they collected the plants for me. We were able to put them all back in the ground. They're still hopefully living, fingers crossed. But it really showed to me that there is buy-in from the community because this is doing something for them and for their community, and they feel ownership of it. They help to design it, they help to build it, and they're using it. And so really for me, that is a measurable outcome, even though there has not been any documentation necessarily of it. It's more just in interacting.
Yeah. Sure. Yep.
I would like to add that in addition to like creative storytelling, also leaning to social media and the internet where possible. Keeping in mind that not everybody has access to the devices, to the accounts and things like that. But wherever possible, trying to capture what people are already putting out there, giving them that Instagram moment or whatever, and then looking to those sort of softer measures as well, evidence wherever possible to kind of cohesively create a much stronger narrative and a better story.
Great.
And if I could just add one more thing, you know, as we get smarter about this, the installations or the programming are really increasingly designed with specific learning outcomes in mind, right? And so if it's an art-focused or a science-focused either activity or installation, we're able to look at the extent to which children have assimilated those concepts after experiencing that installation or program. Increasingly, we have work being done in partnership with elementary schools so that the playgrounds that are being redesigned or rebuilt outside that school are being designed to complement specific learning objectives of the schools. And so we'll be watching to see whether those learning outcomes that are being measured at the school are improving at a higher rate thanks to the investment in this playful learning spaces that are being created. So not necessarily the neighborhood level yet, but at least an institutional level.
Sure, sure. So as we, at Brookings are thinking about, we'll be really focused on building these networks, on really scaling this work, but we also know that it's not easy in communities, right? I think everybody here is enthusiastic about this idea. We know something about how it works, and we think it probably should be in more places and really be adopted more widely. But there are challenges. And Sarah, when we talked a few days ago prior to the panel, you raised some of this in your comments of saying, it's been a bit of a long road on some of these projects. Can you tell us sort of more about those challenges and what you found some of the barriers have been and how you've overcome them?
Sure, absolutely. And actually, this brings to mind a conversation that Nidhi and I were having earlier about the timeline for making this change. And I think you said it's 10 to 15 years oftentimes to see change come about. And so I think that, the work of the Play Collaborative has been around for a long time, really pushing forward the effort of the Hazelwood Play Trail while the idea is much older. The actual work really began about 2 years ago. And so one of the big projects that we had undertaken was to convert this vacant lot, which used to actually be, was called a tot lot. It was a small playground built in the 30s, decommissioned, and was an abandoned parking lot for a couple of decades. And so we had early on these conversations with city planning and with the Department of Public Works and the city of Pittsburgh around how to transform these spaces. And there was sort of this handshake agreement about what was going to happen with this city-owned property. And so we worked with a bunch of teens in the community to design it and brought in a design firm to actually do the design work. And in my mind, I stepped into this role and was like, oh, this is great. We've got the design drawings up. We have the agreement from the city. We're going to go ahead and move forward and turn this into a really beautiful event space. And what happened was that at the city level, there were some changes in the structure of the government in that DPW, the Department of Public Works, was split into Department of Public Works and the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. I have no background in any of this. I'm on the ground, do the programming kind of person, and I stepped in and we had conversations about, okay, well, we need to raise the surface of the parking lot and re-asphalt it. Well, now that doesn't fall under DPW, that falls under DOMI. And so it started this whole other conversation with a new director and with a new entity that I had not had any interaction with, who were not aware of this program. And so it was a really interesting learning curve to understand that sometimes these things take time, and it was very frustrating from my level. I was going to community meetings and talking about what was going to be happening and just kept hitting red tape after red tape. But I did find that, if you just keep going forward and you just keep talking to people, it can get done. But often, and especially with some of the continuing work that we've done along the Play Trail, it is finding the spaces to do the work and then understanding what needs to be put in place for sustainability. So for the example that I gave of the grocery store, the woman who owns the market, it's not her building. And so while she agreed to do the programming or have the installation put up, we had to then approach her, the building owner, and talk to him about what we were going to do with the space. A couple of the other locations that we had chosen with the community, it turned out that they didn't own the space themselves and they couldn't make that decision. And so while we wanted to be putting play along the way installations in the public realm, I got very gung-ho about bus stops and things like that. Those are things that there are barriers that are in place for good reason. I mean, when you're putting art out in the public realm, you have to be wary of what that art is saying and how that's going to affect people. But I think for us, one of the biggest challenges was really understanding how to reach out to the right entities to make the correct connections in order to make the work happen. And then the other thing is this idea of ownership, of the public feeling ownership, so that if something does happen, if there is vandalism that is occurring, that they are letting you know and that there are steps that are in place to help overcome that and work with that. And so I really have found that involving the community has made all of the difference because they want that space to be successful.
So you raised a lot of issues there around working with particularly public entities and, turnover of staff, working with different agencies at different points in the process. You raised issues around ownership. These, when we talk about installations in the public realm, particularly, they're often going to be in public spaces that, or non-public spaces that are owned by somebody else. How do you deal with that? And then you talked about other issues around ownership, which is partly around really that community ownership and that maintenance over time. So Elliot and Indeed, you have, in your own work, have you run into similar or other barriers, and how have you dealt with them?
So I'll go first. Always barriers, obviously. Public spaces, there are like a bajillion entities that own all the small pieces of the things. So in the work that we do, we try to really, really hit hard on the point that let's first define who the community is and who the priority audiences in that community are. Priority obviously given to the more vulnerable, the more of a priority audience that becomes. And for children in marginalized communities, children in low-income communities, they kind of fit at the top of that priority audience. So really understanding whose life it is that needs to be transformed with them is the first order of business. And then once that community is defined, to then get to kind of the vision of change, like starting to visualize change. And by having a vision, it helps you be an advocate, because advocacy, by God, is hard and it takes a while. So arming yourself with that vision that can be used as an advocacy tool, but also visions are more flexible than physical designs and things. So it's continuing to lean into that flexibility and then looking for allies in the private and public realm all at the same time, because I know that our public entities are a little bit trapped in their silos. We're slowly getting out of that, but looking at unlikely allies in the public and private realm, and also understanding that social innovation really will happen at the intersection of the three sectors, the public, the private, and the for-purpose sector, which many of us are a part of. So continuing to think about how can we overlay all those three sectors together would be what would help us, and that's what has helped places. But again, it does take a while. It does take a lot of silo busting, but then keeping in mind that priority audience, that vision that they had, and staying flexible and nimble with that mission is what has allowed our communities, not us, because again, our communities do the work, has allowed them to be able to make the change.
And Elliot, I want to put a finer point on something that you just said. When we talk about public, private, civic sectors, part of this is getting them bought in, right? And bought into that vision so that they will be more supportive and hopefully are erecting fewer barriers in the process. So, this whole idea around playful learning landscapes is this fusion, right? Between learning and play and public spaces. So, Elliot, to what extent have you found that fusion, particularly that integration of the learning into play, where maybe it's harder to get in a limited, in environments of limited resources, if it's harder to get that support over play alone, how much has that infusion of the learning really helped maybe get more, buy-in or more traction among Philadelphia leaders so that you can get some of these projects done?
Yeah, I think the integration, the intersectionality of that has been essential. to the traction that it's gotten and the momentum it's gotten in Philadelphia, because in some ways it's been able to attach itself to other efforts that already have momentum. And I think that's a key. So we have a local campaign for grade level reading, and I know later Ralph Smith will talk a little bit about that, but we call it Read by Fourth in Philadelphia. It's all about engaging adults and children in order to increase reading proficiency. And as they think about opportunities to do that, playful learning, the learning piece, fits exactly in with that larger effort that's already involving 100 organizations across the city. And so this layered on top of that has given it great momentum. And similarly, as communities think about revitalizing and restoring play opportunities for kids, which is an area that has suffered from terrible underinvestment over decades in Philadelphia, they're really looking to maximize the benefits that kids can get from those new investments that are coming in. So the new play space, that yes, it can be fun for kids. Yes, it can give them physical exercise and opportunity. It can also build their early learning skills. Communities get that. Neighborhood groups understand that this is an added advantage for a minimal additional investment that can be offered to their children, and have really embraced it, right? We like to use super simple examples. If you want a sliding board and there's going to be a ladder, put numbers next to each of those steps, or put colors on each of those steps, and you spark conversation among children or between children and adults that wouldn't have happened otherwise if those very small subtle prompts weren't incorporated into the design. And so sharing that with community groups, with city leaders has been really key. Look, it's no secret that early language and early literacy is a huge challenge in our cities. And in Philadelphia, that's definitely true. And so anything that can be done to move that needle forward while also meeting the other needs of community members and residents has been really embraced.
Great. Well, this has been great, and I want to make sure that we leave some time for all of you to ask questions of our panel. So Karen has the mic. Anyone? Lots of people. Great. Point. I'm going to start here.
Thank you. Jerry Wind, Reimagine Education Program. A quick question on the measurement. Have you done any measurement on the impact on the adults learning? We heard about the impact on the kids. What about the impact on the parents or the others involved in the learning process?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that some of the evaluation work that we've done has included both observation, right? It's change in adult behavior, so that's sort of the best demonstration of adult learning in some ways, is the way they're interacting with their children. We've also done qualitative and survey work following some of the experiences, both programmatic and installation, where the adults have shared their takeaways from that experience. And so that's some of the evidence that we have emerging from this work.
Great. All right, we're going to do a couple at once. Let's see, we'll go here and then right behind, and we'll go down the line on this side of the room.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ankita Chachra from NACTO's Global Designing Cities Initiative. We've been working on a program called Streets for Kids, and really looking at cities from the place-based perspective of how do you design cities that work for children and caregivers, not only from safety, but also from education. And I know Kathy was a part of our advisory board on the publication that we just did. And one of the challenges that we're facing now as we're really implementing some of these designs is that the data that we've been collecting and the measurement is very place-based, whereas what you're really looking at impact is a larger conversation. And I'm curious if anyone here in the audience has any guidance or is running into similar issues where, when you're looking at a place and you're talking about social interactions taking place in a particular plaza or a public space, how does that relate to childhood development on a greater impact? And if anyone can make that connection, please find me. I'm looking for answers here.
All right. Place-based versus wider impacts. Okay.
Hi, I'm Laura Huerta Maigas from the Association of Children's Museums. We have your answers. But representing more than 300 children's museums in a field that have been building these spaces for over 120 years, and the talk about scale in this environment, there's been a lot of talk about relationship building, but I'm very interested in a very practical, any trends that people are aware of in practical matters around. Some of these challenges are also about codes and approvals for building codes and permitting. These are the kinds of things that our built environments struggle with all the time. Are you a playground? Are you a public open space? Is a water feature a pool? So how do we, and those are very specific conversations that are not child-centered. So I'm interested in conversations about how you make those conversations with your local officials child-centered for these developments and to promote scale.
Okay, scaling and barriers around just codes and other very practical matters. And we'll take one more over here, and then I'll turn it back to the panel. Yep.
Hello, I'm Tony Bloom with USAID. I'm curious where technology plays a role in this. I mean, I think of kids being isolated, and you don't want that. But I also think about the craze with Pokemon Go that got my kids out in the community. And just curious if you've seen appropriate uses of technology that weave its way within the playful learning landscape vision that you have.
Okay, great.
So I'll start in terms of the codes and the mandates and planning manuals and zoning. This is more a call out to all the advocates in the room and others who might be listening on our Twitterverse. We need to be breaking down a lot of those barriers. So thinking about, again, how our civic agencies work and how they can be reformed is a cause that we should all be putting our weight behind. I personally am getting more and more engaged in that. We need fewer agencies, but we do need an agency for public space that can kind of really talk about the priority audience and that can act as the central body that brings a lot of the different agencies together. We've had these silos for far too long, and in a time where in some ways conversation has become easy, in other ways more segmented, we really have to be thinking about agencies that can actually allow for that seamless thinking, just like seamlessly we experience the public realm. So kind of mimicking how we experience the public realm, our agency should be similar to that. Another advocacy push, this is again, I have the mic, so I'll tell the world this is what we need to do, changing the perception of childhood well-being and really decoupling that from the playground. Because, so thinking about how do we create the kind of interaction and joy that kids experience in the playground, how do we create that everywhere else in the city that they need to be? And my mind immediately goes to kids being strapped in car seats and sitting behind and until they get to that playground not experiencing any joy or movement. So how do we kind of change that perception? And then how do we make the city play for adults? So play for adults and interaction for kids everywhere else. And about technology, I think my answer would be how do we make technology more communal? So things that you can experience together instead of on a singular device. So interactive, larger screens that require more than one person to play almost. That's kind of where we should be thinking about, because one of the reasons that kids are so attached to their devices and the screens, there's nothing else to look at. So how do we create that, leverage technology for communal benefit and interaction, and hopefully interaction with people who are slightly different from us.
Yeah, getting adults out of their screens as well, not just the kids.
I want to add to the scalability and the overcoming the boundaries, the barriers that are in place. So something that we've noticed is really getting in touch with your local council people, for one, has really been helpful for us, especially in Hazelwood, in helping to, they can help push forth initiatives on your behalf. And really it's about making those correct connections. So we also have, myself and a coworker oversee a recess advocacy team, and we look at recess policy on the one hand, but also just recess in general, and looking at all of the different states that are looking at recess. And to tie this back in, it's about making the connection with the people who can push forth, whether that's caregivers and parents, educators, legislators, council people. They are the ones that can help you take the work that you're doing to the next level, help you rethink. You know, if you're trying to work in a public space and there's all sorts of red tape, they want their community members are talking to them about what they want and why they want it, and they're going to want to help you put forth something that is going to be fun and playful for the community. So really, making those connections and making sure that the right people are hearing about the work that you're doing and understanding why it's important to them. I mean, I think even for the recess team, the legislator that we've been talking to, he has kids in school who were not experiencing recess. And so he has a vested interest in pushing for more play within schools. Yeah.
Quick last word by Elliot.
I would commend Jenny Perlman Robinson's report to you on this issue of scaling. Exactly, she calls it forging key alliances as being one of the essential challenges in bringing this to scale. And we think about it in three ways. Rebecca sort of alluded to this earlier. One is making the science available to those people who make the decisions about code and installations. Two is creating some existence proofs. Urban Thinkscape that you saw earlier played a key role in that. It's actually built on private land because of some of the code issues, but it is the existence proof that other people can come and see. And third is making the explicit connection between the opportunity this creates and the explicit goals of that organization or city department. And so we're sort of thinking about doing all three of those things at once in order to bring this to a greater scale.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of you. This has been great. I know I learned a lot. I think you hopefully all learned a lot as well. So I'm going to move forward. I have the greatest pleasure to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Frances Brunette. Frances became the Pratt Institute in New York's 12th president in January of 2018. Before coming to Pratt, she served as the senior vice president and provost at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, and she's held a lot of other university leadership roles along the way. For more than 2 decades, Brunette has been developing and publishing work on multidisciplinary design curricula connecting fields like architecture and engineering and science and technology and humanities, social sciences, and the arts. She's received extensive funding for a lot of this work, has published widely on it, and we're really just grateful for the opportunity to hear her discuss her innovative approaches and work around the connections between education and learning and place and design. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Frances.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.